So I'm so happy to be with you, Raul, here at the Aspen Jazz Fest, right on the cusp of the 20th anniversary of State of Mind, which is probably, I would say, your breakthrough record. You might
Yes.
say that as well, yeah?
Absolutely.
And before we started recording, you mentioned that it took a leap of faith for you to move to New York and kind of go down that path. Can you tell us about like where you were in your life back then? And like,
Well, I was doing lots of studio sessions, singing for other people, and I was in Shakira's band, and I had sort of moved up the ladder of the Miami scene, but I always had an ambition to do my own thing. So, you know, in my 30s, which, as I said off the air, I would not necessarily recommend it, but we decided to move to New York, and it was right after 9/11 too. So people thought we were kind of crazy because, you know, there was all kinds of stuff going on. People were getting stuff sent in the mail and stuff. But it was literally the start of my career as an artist.
yeah, and I remember for me, that was how I was introduced to your work. And I remember you had the song Sunshine, which I feel like was one of the biggest songs of that year. Maybe my perspective is a little weird, but it was an incredible introduction to you and your artistry and what you sort of, your unique sound and sensibility. But that had been something you've been honing
Yes.
for a long time.
Yeah, I you know, in besides the studio sessions, of course, I was doing gigs in you know, the local area, and as the, you know, as my songwriting progressed, I started to slowly inch out of the covers and doing more and more of my songs, and, you know, starting to try to you know, solidify myself as a singer-songwriter instead of just as a musician that plays, you know, covers or whatever. So that was, and I did that in those local gigs, you know, when I was in South Florida. So, you know, I got a taste for playing my own music, basically.
So now let's zoom back a little bit. Like for me, because I'm so familiar with your original compositions, I'm not as familiar with, I've seen you do covers, obviously, but what sort of material were you doing a lot of? I know you love Bill Withers and Stevie Wonder and artists like that.
Yeah, I was doing Al Green stuff. I was doing Stevie Wonder stuff. I was doing Motown, Stax, you know, that sort of thing, you know, just James Taylor, some Bob Dylan, you know.
So where were you introduced to that type of music and all the other things that we scaffold into what makes you you?
Well, you know, I went to school and really started out just kind of loving jazz. And when I started to go into songwriting, it began to be obvious to me that I had to listen. I think Joni Mitchell was the sort of the light bulb. When I heard Court and Spark, it was this kind of great songs coupled with, you know, wonderful playing and, you know, jazz-influenced musicians, you know, Tom Scott and Larry Carlton and all these people that were playing on Court and Spark. And that got me into, you know, I want to be a songwriter. And of course, if you want to be a songwriter, you have to listen to the great masters of songwriting. So I started to, you know, steer away from just the jazz and listen to, you know, the Dylan and the James Taylors and the Princes and the Paul Simons and, you know, all that.
So that's so interesting, and we can zoom all the way back out. Like you have this kind of cosmopolitan view of music, which I think is really cool, but you come from such a small background, small town in New Mexico. I know a lot of our listeners are in Colorado, so they can totally relate to your northern New Mexico like beginnings. So when you started playing music, what did you imagine for yourself beyond that?
I wasn't, until I got to college, I didn't really know what it was like to live in a big city. You know, I lived in New Mexico. Albuquerque was the biggest city, and I rarely visited Albuquerque. So, you know, it was kind of mind-blowing. And, you know, I didn't know about jazz clubs or, you know, the music scene, as it were, in a city, you know. So I didn't imagine anything except that I was really interested in the music. So I was obsessed with just, you know, I remember walking around Embudo, in the valley there between Española and Taos, and there was a program on KUNM, which is the University of New Mexico station. And I'm walking around trying to get the signal to come in because they're playing, you know, Ornette Coleman or, you know, Billy Bang or, you know, Cecil Taylor, you know. And I was in high school and I was absolutely fascinated with it.
And you still love radio today.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I've probably told this story before, but my introduction to jazz was, we were about 9 years old, and we had a Mr. microphone. One of those little, if people from the 70s remember that they sold these toys, it was a little microphone. I think it took a 9-volt battery, and it was a little FM transmitter. And so we would take these mics and, you know, play DJ and play records. And we hooked the mic directly into we opened it up, and instead of using the microphone, we hooked it up directly to the record player so that it would sound better, you know, and all that stuff. But we ran out of music, so we sort of dipped into my dad's collection, which was kind of forbidden, and we pulled out a Miles Davis, Charlie Parker record. And when I heard that, it completely blew my mind at 9 years old, and I just said, I want to hear more of this music. Yeah.
Amazing. So we're here at Aspen Jazz. You're about to perform. What do we have in store? Like, what are you excited to play, to share with people?
Well, I've got a new record that came out last year, so I'll be playing stuff from that. But I'm going to be doing some stuff from State of Mind because it's the 20th anniversary. So I'm going to be pulling out some songs I haven't played in a long, long time. You know, every show's different. You know, I always take a jazz approach to it in the sense that I don't play things exactly the same every time. Of course, you know, I will be doing, you know, quote unquote, the songs that people know, you know, some of those. So, you know, Sunshine and State of Mind and all that.
Absolutely. It's a spectacular record, and it still feels as fresh as when it came out 20 years ago, as far as I'm concerned. But, I mean, you've still been doing so much work with so many artists, Stevie Wonder. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You were I remember seeing you in the Bill Withers documentary,
yes,
which is super cool. Like, what was that like, being involved, tapped for that project?
It was amazing. Bill Withers called me up on the phone and said, you know, I want to write with you. And
Wow.
I thought, wow, that's amazing. But then he threw me a curveball. He said, I want to write in Spanish. And I was like, oh no, who's, you know, of course he doesn't speak Spanish. So we ended up going to his house, and that was where they were filming the documentary. So in the documentary, it actually shows us sort of working on this song.
In process.
Yeah, yeah. And he basically kind of gave me this sort of 2/5, you know, C to F, C minor to F7 thing, and said, you know, I want to write about this friend that I had in Cuba. And so, you know, he would say, the first line is, mi amigo cubano, hola, ¿cómo estás? And I thought, okay, that's kind of, but then we ended up writing this song about, you know, his friend, and they used to work together, they used to build things together, and it turned into a really cool thing. And basically he would tell me, I want you to say this in Spanish. And I would figure out, how do you say, how's your wife in Spanish? I say, ¿Cómo está tu esposa? He'd say, put that in there. That's how we wrote the song.
That's really cool. So, I mean, such a long story career, still in the thick of it as far as I'm concerned. I'm just ruminating on this thing you said even before we opened up the mic. To wrap things up, like, you've had this long career, but really the impetus for your breakthrough was such a leap of faith. Like, so many folks who listen to KUVO are musicians themselves, are in their own thick of it. What would you tell people about, like, a leap of faith in their own career?
Well, I mean, I think for one, you have to have something that it makes you stand out, that makes you different. And one of the things that I realized when I got to New York is there's thousands of guitar players, there's thousands of singers, there's thousands of songwriters, there's, you know, you get to a place like that and you realize that you're a small fish in a very, very large ocean. And so I think it's certainly for any kind of a jazz musician or any kind of a musician that wants to be an artist, I think you have to try to figure out your artistic voice. What is it that you hear that nobody else is doing that you can do? Right. And it doesn't have to be something big, it just can be a way of playing, it can be a sound, it can be the way you put genres together, it can be anything like that. You know, and that's what set me apart in New York. Because, you know, you go to New York and you play a song and, you know, what makes you different from the other 1,000 people that are doing it?
Right. Yeah. No, I get that. I think that's the thing, woodshedding, right? Like figuring out where you fit in this great story of the music.
And I think there's a certain, and you know, everybody's different, but the one advantage of going to New York as a slightly older person, or, you know, more developed, is that I was ready. You know, I was clear. Like, I'm not going to New York to fill my nights with wedding gigs. Like, if I'm going to do that, then I might as well stay in South Florida where the weather's better. You know what I mean? So I was clear that I was going there to do my thing. And if I couldn't do my thing, I was going to move back to Florida.
The stakes were high.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for this interview. This has been very enlightening because obviously we've never spoken, but I've just been such a fan is probably the word. Respecter of your craft is probably a little stronger.
Well, thank you, and thank you to KUVO. You guys have always been really good to me. I always listen to it. Sometimes I listen to it on the internet as well. So
awesome. Thank you. KUVO.org.
Yeah. And you can get, you know, you can get Alexa to play it, or any of these, you know, radio tuners you can get to play it. So
the radio geek comes out.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.